and welcome to Rainwater Harvesting in Virginia, a 30,000 foot view. Our purpose today is to just provide a progress report on where we are in Virginia regarding developing regulations for harvested rainwater use. We'll be talking about the following things in this roughly 1 hour session. A brief history of rainwater harvesting, a discussion of why we're planning to regulate it in Virginia, a summary of what environmental health professionals think of this idea, description of some of the challenges we face, and we want to let you know where we are now in the process and where we're going. So we'll start with a brief history lesson. Rainwater harvesting by humans dates to at least 4000 BC. I believe that is the earliest record of some sort of capturing container, some sort of device to deliberately harvest rainwater. But I suppose if you think about it, everything on life has been harvesting rainwater as long as there's been life. Just point your head to the sky when it's raining and have a drink. Rainwater harvesting was common in the Roman Empire. Some of their aqueducts remain to this day. And for centuries in Venice, the water supply depended on this. And they actually used porous stone flooring and sand filters and insulated collection wells, which sounds like a pretty advanced technology for the time. Of course, it's all been replaced by piped water these days. In Virginia, rainwater has been harvested for centuries. Obviously, the indigenous population has done this in various ways. And when European settlement came, I think there was sort of a concern that some of the water, well water and so on in Virginia could be kind of hard. So a lot of times they would use rainwater simply because it's naturally soft and it was good for laundry. You see here the study that was done by Virginia Tech back in the 1990s. This is just an evaluation of rooftop cistern storage systems. It was actually in Dickinson County, which is in coal country. This was done in 1997, published in 98. Cisterns were largely homemade. There was no filtration, no disinfection. And as far as the integrity of the cisterns, as you can see, the gutters from the roof are running to this something you see in the field there in this photograph. I've blown this up rather large, and it looks like a piece of plywood covering perhaps a cinder block structure. And that shape on top of the plywood that's holding it down, I don't know if it's a car battery or an old cooler or cinder block or what, but obviously that's what we were dealing with. Construction, who knows? And unfortunately, there are systems like this probably still in existence in parts of Virginia. So what did that study find out? Well, in that county, 31% of the cistern users relied on rainwater to fill the cisterns. So that left roughly 70% who had water hauled in by truck to fill the cistern. Of the ones that used rainwater, 80% of them would run underwater periodically. Obviously, if it doesn't rain, you don't get to refill it. The water was not particularly pleasant necessarily, odor, taste, cloudiness. The roofing material included primarily shingles, but there were also tin roofs and slate. And they did 2 studies where they did a lot of just the sort of general ground or water quality tests that are typically associated with private wells. What did they find? Well, they found that only 50% of the water samples met drinking water standards. Not too great. Most of the failures were total coliform. They had other problems, which included iron and E. coli and sodium. Interestingly enough, metals were not largely a problem. There were a couple of instances, but overall that didn't seem to be an issue. And so that's a story of rainwater in the 20th century in parts of Virginia. Now, starting in the 1970s and moving up into the 2010s, various things happened. Plumbing and building codes began to adapt standards for reuse water, and that's rainwater and also gray water, which we'll discuss shortly. Things like, separate piping, fixtures, so forth. Around the 2010s, Virginia Department of Health developed guidance for rainwater harvesting systems, not regulation, guidance for their use. Technology has improved immensely over time with respect to capture and treatment of rainwater. And there has been an uptick of people interested in improving rainwater harvesting as a technology. People who think green, who are concerned about climate change and so forth, have been talking to the General Assembly, and that's been one of the things that has brought us here today. In fact, in 2018, the General Assembly issued House Bill 192. Here it is. You'll be tested on this later. Read it all in 3 seconds and answer a bunch of questions. Kidding. Basically, what this did is revise Code of Virginia section 32.1-248.2. And the key takeaways, rather than reading all that fine print, is this instructed the Department of Health to develop regulations for gray water and rainwater. Now, gray water is, it's actually a form of sewage, as it's defined here in Virginia, but it's what comes from showers and sinks and washing machines that don't wash diapers. Rainwater is precipitation falls from the sky, and in terms of rainwater harvesting, it's something that is deliberately captured on a roof and then stored in a tank or cistern before it hits the ground. We were also instructed to work with DEQ to promote the use of groundwater and rainwater, and to consider rainwater as an independent source of fresh water for the citizens of Virginia. So again, this puts us to 2018. So on July 1st, when this became law, we met internally to discuss how to figure this out. We determined that gray water regulations could best be handled in the pending revision of the sewage handling and disposal regulations. These are the regulations that address septic tanks and drain fields, individual, non-public sewage disposal. We determined that rainwater harvesting would be a standalone project, and we were able in 2018 to assemble a group of stakeholders and have 2 meetings to get the ball rolling on this. The General Assembly, when they met in 2019, issued a joint resolution. Key takeaways from this was not a bill per se. This is not this didn't change the Code of Virginia or anything else. This was just instructing the Department of Health to evaluate 5 specific considerations, things like cross-connection and that sort of thing related to the use of rainwater, and to report our findings to the General Assembly. And during that 2019 session, there were a lot of other rainwater harvesting bills. Some of them didn't get passed, some of them did. What I'm trying to stress here is that there's strong interest in our elected leaders to make this a reality. So, as we noted, rainwater harvesting already occurs in Virginia. It's regulated under the Uniform Statewide Building Code, specifically the plumbing code more than anything else. Department of Health has our harvesting and use guidelines. And there's other sources that play into this. These are primarily the non-potable use. In fact, they're 100% non-potable use. Primarily irrigation and water to use for toilet flushing and urinals, often in things like schools and other types of buildings that are not 24-hour occupancy. As far as rainwater for drinking water, that does occur in Virginia for larger systems that are subject to the Virginia Waterworks regulations. At the time that the legislative acts that I've discussed were first occurring, there was one waterworks that relied on harvested rainwater for a potable water source, and that's the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's Brock Environmental Center in Virginia Beach. In early August 2020, the Office of Drinking Water here at the Department of Health issued a construction permit for a rainwater harvesting-based waterworks at Warrenton Fauquier Airport. And that, I just checked this week, as a matter of fact, and they're hoping to have that construction finished and the waterworks up and running, as early as this autumn. So it's that will make two. In terms of our requirement to develop a regulation for rainwater harvesting, one option would be to take the existing guidance that we prepared back in 2011 and just change that into a regulation. The pros of this, there's only one, it's relatively quick and easy to do. However, one thing it does not do is address local building officials' biggest concern, which is that it doesn't address water quality. And so, the way building permits work is the building officials issue the permits and they issue the occupancy and use permits, but they rely on the Department of Health to say, okay, here's a viable water supply. And when we're talking about non-potable use, which is what existing guidelines address, we have nothing about any sort of water quality standard. And so that's something that we really need to address in Virginia. Again, to just take our existing guidance, turn it into a regulation, is not really consistent with House Bill 192, because we were charged to consider rainwater as a source of fresh water in Virginia and to encourage its use. So we wouldn't really be living up to the standard that the General Assembly has placed on us and expects us to fulfill. And also, as I mentioned, there's been a ton of bills released in the General Assembly, some of which have passed, some of which hasn't. The key point is that there's really interest in it. And right now, our only charge is to develop a regulation. So we're free from any sort of political influence. We're able to develop this based on science and existing technology and common sense. So if we don't really take it seriously now and make a really good college try at developing a good regulation, there may be future legislation which puts conditions on what we may or may not include in a regulation. I hope that makes sense. Another option is to, as I said, develop a regulation to address both non-potable and to at least explore potable use, because that was part of the charge of House Bill 192. The pros of this is that it addresses a growing need. I'm going to come back to this. As I just mentioned, it doesn't limit what the regulation can cover. We can really work very carefully and look at the best science and technology. An issue about potable use and these are, as I mentioned earlier, it's already possible to do a large public system, but for a smaller system, maybe for like a single house, it may not be an economically viable choice compared to a well, or connecting to public water. We have issues in terms of operations and maintenance and enforcement. We're talking potentially about drinking water here. At least in terms of the potable side. And, to do systems for potable use would be an entirely new permitting program, and as of this point, there's no funding provided to make this happen, so that would need to be addressed. Okay, I said we're going to talk about the growing need. What's the growing need as far as rainwater harvesting? Well, one thing is that there are geographic locations in Virginia where there's no public water supply and there's limited feasibility for private wells. So it's not a lot of places, but they do exist. Coal country is one good example of this. Any of you are familiar with the Chesapeake impact crater? About 35 million years ago, the part of the Virginia that's mostly the Chesapeake Bay now, was hit by a meteor, and it did a little number on the geology of Virginia. So there are parts of Virginia in the eastern area where there's just all the confined aquifers have just briny water as a result of this impact crater, and it's not suitable for drinking, and the only water source is the unconfined surface aquifer, which is not ideal. There's always the issue of contaminated sites. This could be, someone who lives next to a gas station who's had an underground storage tank leak, or things like that. There's always the issue of what we don't know yet. Currently, there's a lot of work going on in Virginia and across the country about the PFAS chemicals, which were not really on anyone's radar just a few years ago. And it's possible that there are, water quality issues that will come to be known in the future, and so those could also be an impact potentially on existing sources of drinking water. The Department of Environmental Quality manages the groundwater east of I-95 because there's been a danger of us, with uncontrolled use would essentially mine all the water before it could naturally recharge, and there would be huge water supply issues. So there are, in fact, water supply issues. So DEQ manages groundwater use in those areas, and that's not going to be anything that goes away. And then there's the early adopters I mentioned before, the people that just think, hey, let's be more water conscious. And then finally, there's the climate change issues that we need to think about. And to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, this is a permit for some septic tank drain fields on a land that's near the Chesapeake Bay. This permit was issued in 2002. I hope you can see my cursor here. The yellow box here is surrounding two separate drain fields for the properties there, and they're maintaining the minimum 70-foot separation from shellfish waters, which is something that is required by regulation to protect the shellfish harvesting areas. And so that's what this permit is showing, a 2002 permit. And where I'm putting my cursor right now is sort of the bottom left corner of this drain field parcel, right above where it says S66. Okay, was the one who drew up the original permit, 18 years before. It's underwater now. There is change to the sea level, and that's affecting potentially the entire any part of Virginia that's encroached by the Atlantic Ocean or the Chesapeake Bay or the estuaries to the Chesapeake Bay. And so, as this happens, this is a concern in terms of water supply. So I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and talk about Department of Health's opinion when the General Assembly said that we shall develop rainwater harvesting regulations. I did it was very casual. This is not super defensible scientific poll, but it was a poll on what our various environmental health personnel thought of developing rainwater harvesting regulations. And I just want to go over a brief part of that, the answers to 3 questions. One is, I asked, is rainwater harvesting for human consumption consistent with the mission of the Department of Health? That mission is to protect the health and promote the well-being of all people in Virginia. Here's the answer. 58% said yes, it is. Another 17% said it depends. That the "in depends" meant yes, as long as the water is treated and filtered and disinfected and made safe to drink. So that's okay. 75% said yeah, it's consistent with our mission. 17% said no, it isn't, and 8% didn't have an opinion one way or the other. So 75%, 25%. The takeaway here is not 100% of folks are on board with this idea, or at least weren't 3 years ago. Another question: what do the environmental health professionals see as the biggest hurdles in developing a regulation? And this was just we had already our group of stakeholders and the folks working on this regulation had already thought of these things. We wanted to just make sure we had enough opinions that we would hopefully think of everything. So a lot of issues here, water quality being the most important one. That's tied into risk management. So those are the really big issues. But backflow, protection, is there enough water to even do this coming from rainwater? How do you handle inspection and enforcement and operation and maintenance and so on? So it was reassuring to know that everyone sort of felt like the same things were important. And then the last question was kind of a gut check question. We asked our environmental health managers, would you let your mother, an infant, your grandchild drink this water? Would you drink it yourself? 50% said no. And then the other 50% said yes, either just an unqualified yes or yes as long as it's treated and disinfected. That shows how big a challenge I think this is, that in order to put into effect what the General Assembly wants us to do, what Virginia wants to see to address the problems I've identified, we've got 50-50 environmental health professionals' opinions on, should we be doing this or not? So something to keep in mind. Some other issues that came to light as we've been doing this, there's the local ordinance is a concern. Some people, if they're able to get a rainwater harvesting system that's appropriate for all their needs, the water supply for non-potable and potable uses, and they're living in a location where by ordinance they must connect to a public water supply. Those situations exist throughout the state. Virginia Department of Health has no voice in that, but that is something that will probably need to be addressed as we move forward on our pathway here. Looking at national and international standards on how to do this, there's a wide variety, so there was a lot of homework for us to do to learn all this stuff. One thing that is good is essentially the building code is ready for it, in terms of water piping for non-potable designations and so forth. Whatever we come up with should be able to tie in with the building code fairly readily. I'm sure there might need to be some tweaks back and forth, and we've had the Department of Housing and Community Development involved in our stakeholder group. So, these are problems, if they exist, that are readily solvable and will not require a huge overhaul of the plumbing code or anything like that. I mentioned before, when we talk about paying for it all, permitting this and the danger of unfunded mandates kind of thing. So we'll need to be, communicating these issues as we move forward. We feel this may justify more authority relative to private wells because all the public drinking water supplies now are required to meet very stringent water quality testing and communication to the users. Our rainwater harvesting for any potable use will have similar water quality standards that will have to be maintained. Private wells in Virginia do not have water quality standards, with the exception of in some localities where they are required under local ordinance. But for the most part, private wells, in terms of how they are regulated by the Department of Health, it's the construction standards and where they are located relative to potential threats, and that's it. So, in order to have consistency regarding, water that would be used for potable purposes, we need to explore the reality of needing to test private water well quality on some sort of basis. Are there stages of how to do this? Maybe the use of the property addresses how it's used. Is it a residential process, commercial, or some sort of special use? I'm going to come back to that later. Do we need to have some creative options to make sure that operation and maintenance happens when it's used for potable use, especially? What happens if a homeowner who's very environmentally conscious, green, and he says, "Oh, this is great, I'll build a house that uses rainwater for the drinking water supply. That's fantastic." And then at some point down the road, it gets sold to someone who may not have the same passion, but just wants to turn on the tap to make sure the water is safe to drink. How do we make sure that those kind of issues get addressed realistically? So that's what's brought us to sort of the gist of where we are today, which is we're now developing regulations. And let me give you a breakdown on that. The Notice of Intended Regulatory Action, we drafted this in December 2019. It got submitted in early 2020. It did not get published until 2021. Now, that's not unusual because sometimes these have to go through, several layers of review from the Attorney General and the Secretary of the boards of Health and Human Resources, Office of Planning and Budget, the Governor's Office. And if you think about it, 2020 was pretty heavily all COVID all the time. So it was not surprised that it took a while for the NOWRA to get published. It did get published, and the public comment period ended on March 31st, and we received no comments. Now, this is not unusual because a lot of times, only the most interested parties will be paying attention enough to know that the NOWRA was published, and it's when the draft regulation comes out that we anticipate getting, the meaty questions. So, as I mentioned, we've had a group together since 2018, and we have been drafting regulations. We now have a preliminary draft, and it is our intention to present it to the Board of Health in its December meeting this year. That's the first step to get it on the way to being published as a draft regulation for public comment. Now, there's some regulatory challenges, obviously, that to be figured out. One thing is ensuring consistency of supply. It doesn't rain all the time. The way precipitation works, anyone who's got a lawn they water or flower garden or whatever, rain is either not happening or too much. It's very rarely the exact amount of rain you need at the exact amount of time. And so, we have to make sure that there's a consistency of supply, especially in terms of potable water use. They can't let people run out of drinking water. Obviously, we have water quality issues. Now, water quality testing can be expensive, so we want to make sure we handle that in economical and feasible way that is protective of public health without breaking anyone's bank entirely. Operation and maintenance, I mentioned those issues. With respect to cisterns, anything that's going to be an underground water storage, we would have the same separation distance considerations that we have for private wells and on-site sewage and all this. Make sure that there's safety factors built in. This is how we're planning on doing it. If it's going to be a potable system that's not large enough to be a waterworks, waterworks is handled with its own regulatory program, then there will be a permit. You will be a permit from the Department of Health required to have a rainwater harvesting system that provides potable use, whether that's full-time or part-time, in a combined system. If it's a non-potable system, we won't be requiring a permit, but we will begin registering them so that we have a way to track how many of them there are and how much rainwater is being captured and so on and so forth. Everything is going to be based on what are called end tiers. And what I mean by everything is the materials for the system, how a system is designed, the treatment, the filtration and disinfection, etc., operation and maintenance, the water quality. It's all based on end tiers. Now, what are end tiers? Well, you remember earlier I talked about should we have different systems for residential, commercial, The way that made the most sense to do this was to follow the International Code Council and basically the EPA and what we're seeing in other states, and use end tiers. End tiers are based on two things. The first thing is the water potable or non-potable, number one. Number two, what is the relative risk of human contact? So we start with end tier number one, which is non-potable with a low risk of contact. So this might be water, for example, that's used for a drip irrigation where there's no spraying, there's no aerosol, issue with the water. That's one thing. Or maybe it's spray irrigation, but it's in a controlled, set way where it's, behind a fenced area where no humans would be near, or just so remote that it could be looked at as a low risk. And actually ice rinks, turning the water into an ice rink would be another low risk of contact. End tier number two is non-potable with a medium risk of contact. And these are things like water that would be used to be routed to a washing machine, for example, or for toilet and urinal flushing, medium risk of contact. End tier number three, non-potable, would have a high risk of contact. This could be the hose on your house. So it'd be, watering the lawn, watering a vegetable garden, washing your car, those types of things where there is a risk of, a higher risk of human contact. And then the highest standard would be the potable water use. This is water that is intended for human consumption. Now, we're looking to have a performance-based regulation. And so we're going to have performance standards, performance requirements. A lot of these are general, and this is like the low-hanging fruit. You must comply with the building code and the plumbing code, The minimum design standards shall conform to various nationally recognized standards. Equipment shall be, and materials must be NSF certified. Those types of things, and certifications also that would apply to the people who are the manufacturers and then the inspectors, the designers, and so forth. Continuity of water supply must be ensured. There has to be a backup water system in case it doesn't rain. This can be a public water supply, it could be a private well, it could be trucking in water. There just has to be something in place to make sure that there is continuity of the water supply. And there's different ways that are being addressed in the regulation in terms of how the water continuity would happen. Water quality standards, obviously critical, not just for the potable use, but for those tier 2 and tier 3 non-potable uses where there is some risk of human contact. The operation and maintenance standards, what gets inspected, how often does the water quality get tested, what are you testing it for, so forth. We want it to be performance-based rather than prescriptive. So that's the goal we're going by. Now, some key references constantly being looked at in this is NSF, the American Rainwater Catchment System Association. They have a standard. There's the International Code of, International Code Council. They have a standard. It's already pretty much the Canadian standard, but it's actually an international standard. The National Blue Ribbon Commission is a group, a nationwide group of engineers and public health professionals and so forth who are addressing primarily the non-potable use of reuse water, including rainwater, but also moving towards potable use. And log reduction targets. This is something that when this regulation becomes regulation will be very heavily relied on. What these are is, a lot of times it's very difficult to, especially if you're talking for a single home, for example, to test for every potential contaminant that is included in, say, the national drinking water standards. And in some of these cases, they're very expensive tests, and in some cases we're testing for things that they're not necessarily going to be a lot of labs that are able to test. So the log reduction target, or LRT, is a way to address the performance of the treatment, the combination of filtration and disinfection, and to what standard does it address pathogens and viruses and bacteria and metals and so forth, and then by having a standard, performance standard, this is how a system would be judged to be appropriate for, say, end use tier 3 versus end use tier 4. So with that, a little bit more about them. Our current, not ready for prime time draft regulation, as I said, it hasn't even gone to the Board of Health yet. It lists the log reduction targets for the end use tiers, and it's based on the ICC, the International Code Standard from 2018. And so we specify that for end use tier 4, for example, you have to have a certain LRT. And that's where we are right now. The LRTs that are used in these existing building standards are based on a number of different sources, but one is the EPA, which has prepared an LRT table about sometime in the early 2010s. And then state of California has its own LRT table. They don't exactly always agree, and that's led to some confusion amongst, if nothing else, the manufacturers, installers of existing systems for non-potable use. But the EPA is updating there. They've just undertaken a very large study, and they're planning they will have an updated LRT table in just a month or two, actually, from when I'm giving this presentation. And there'll be a report to go along with this. Now, this is not EPA's drinking water group. They only address surface water and groundwater sources. This is EPA research and development. So these tables may not have the same, they don't have the same regulatory authority that the maximum contaminant levels do, for example. This is a research and development thing. But the National Blue Ribbon Commission is going to be meeting, as early as maybe January 22 to review the EPA report and the new tables and to decide whether to lend support to them as a national standard. And I think the direction of the group, and I'm one of the commissioners on this group, the intention is to hopefully find a way to say, okay, this is the standard that we are behind as far as national use. The advantage of doing this, is that if they do this, then our group, our stakeholders who are developing this regulation, we can make a decision. It might be better that instead of having a regulation that lists the 2018 standards, or perhaps the 2021 standards or 2022 standards that EPA comes up with, just listing them. Those are going to be probably updated by EPA on maybe a 5-year schedule. That's their target plan. If we are able to say, okay, well, and then the NBC will say, yes, this is the appropriate national standard, then perhaps our regulation could say, the water quality, everything associated with a rainwater harvesting system shall comply with the LRTs in, the NRBC supported national standard. Then if any of those change in the future as EPA does more work and so forth, we don't have to revise our regulation because the standard is still what the regulation says you have to follow. It takes a long time to revise a regulation. Even a fast track regulation revision in Virginia takes some time to go through. So this is a way to make sure that our regulation stays up to date as these national things change. It's kind of analogous. You could think of it, say, to saying you have to, your piping or whatever for your steel that you use to build your bridge has to meet ASTM whatever. Then you don't have to keep changing your regulation every time ASTM updates their standard. So that's the approach we're going to be looking at for this. Now, I mentioned that we're going to be presenting this to the Board of Health in early December, and this stuff's going to happen after that. We'll probably just include a description and a discussion of this when we present it to the board, because it takes the board approving us to publish a draft regulation is still quite some time before the regulation becomes final. It's going to be at least a year, and more likely more than a year, or even 2 years from before the final regulation's in place. So, in summary, we are developing regulations for rainwater harvesting because we're required to when House Bill 192 in 2018 revised the Code of Virginia, telling us that we have to develop regulations. We are including at least the potential, and most likely we will be regulating harvesting standards to include potable water use, because it's pretty strongly suggested in the language that we've been asked to work with. And it's complicated. I've been talking for 44 minutes and 30 seconds now, and it's complicated. The feedback that we have received from environmental health professionals is a mix of proceed with caution or just a flat no, and there hasn't been much in between. Now, that was 3 years ago, but it does make us want to proceed very carefully to make sure we're really thinking of what we should be thinking of. There's a need for this in terms of water supply. I delved a little bit into that. We have the opportunity to develop a strong regulation, well grounded in science and technology, and hopefully with all voices heard to really develop the right balance in terms of what it's going to cost for the regulated community to comply. Everything is performance based on the end use tiers, the LRTs, and the performance standards that the designers will need to meet as they design systems, and then the installers will have to uphold when they build them. Pretty obvious it's going to have ramifications for builders, for real estate professionals, for plumbers and other construction folks, homeowners, you name it. So, as I said, we hope to have a draft regulation in front of the Board of Health in December 2021, and so it will be published for public comment, hopefully in the first half of 2022. And we want review and comment from as wide a group of the public as possible. That's one of the reasons I'm here talking to you today, is to help get the word out that this is coming, and so people will be able to get a hold of the draft regulation as soon as they can, really give it good study, comment. That's how we can ensure we're trying getting the best product in front of the public. So please stay tuned. Ask questions. I'm going to share my contact information, and it's here for anyone to at any time who wants to know more about this. Please be in touch. This is a very exciting opportunity. It's not just happening in Virginia, it's happening nationwide, but it's just a great thing. We're moving in exciting new ways. And so thank you all for your attention, and please stay tuned.